Hi, and welcome to another Conversations for a Better World. Tonight's guest is a woman, Jen Hoey. This is Jen's book, and the title of the book, A Regular Story That Rarely Gets Told. As Jen says, she did not for a moment think something like this could ever happen to her child, but it did, despite her vigilance. This is her daughter's story and how she created Not My Kid. Please welcome Jen Hoey. Thank you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'll just say it's the first time I'm talking to an audience, so if I lose my train of thought, just bear with me. I thought I'd start by telling you all a little bit about myself, and then I'll go on to tell you about the journey to where I've got to today. And I'll also let you know how I've educated my 8-year-old with all the knowledge that I've gained over the years. And I'll end by providing you with a few tips on how to prevent online child exploitation. So I'm a mum with 3 children. I have an 8-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 20-year-old. And it really was my older children that were the catalyst to me getting involved in this space. I was born in Cape Town, South Africa. My mum's from South Africa, my dad is Swiss. I grew up in a very, very strict environment. And being a sensitive child, this actually affected me, and I had, as a result, a very turbulent adolescence. So much so that I do wonder sometimes if I was that teenager today with access to social media and the internet, where I would actually be. At 19, I left South Africa and moved to Switzerland with my former husband. We were intending to backpack around Europe, but for various reasons we got stuck in Switzerland for 12 years. I spent a year in London and arrived in Australia late 2004 with a little girl who was not yet 4 months and a nearly 3-year-old little boy. When my children were 4 and 6, I separated from their father. For a number of years, I became aware of the fact that for all sorts of reasons, our relationship was no longer a healthy one, and I didn't want it to be a model for my children. Our divorce and separation wasn't acrimonious, but nevertheless, I got some support from a psychologist to help myself and my children. And this is where I learned a lot about emotional coaching, which really helped me in parenting the children. I'm now currently married to my second husband, who's a psychiatrist, and I manage his practice during the day, and we have an 8-year-old little boy together. Now, the timing of this talk is very interesting because it was actually around this time of the year, 9 years ago, that my daughter changed. She was an outgoing, lively little girl, and overnight she became listless. She gave up everything she enjoyed. She loved dancing, gymnastics, making slime. She started eating a lot less, but the most noticeable thing was her separation anxiety from me. I remember one evening we were going for a walk together, and she asked me if I had any hopes or dreams for the future. I found this really odd coming from a 9-year-old, so I said, yes, I do. Why are you asking? And she said, I have none. And this was a red flag for me. I was concerned she may be developing a depressive syndrome. A few days later, the school called me and asked me to come and fetch her. They said she was inconsolable and that she was telling her teacher that everyone in the world has a warm red heart, but hers was cold and blue. Naturally, I agreed to come and fetch her, but before I did so, I contacted a pediatrician we'd seen, and fortunately, he was able to see us that afternoon. So I picked up my daughter, we went straight from the school to the appointment. He assessed her and he confirmed my suspicions. He diagnosed her with clinical depression, and he gave us a referral to a psychologist. What he said to me is, I'm giving you 4 weeks, and if I don't see a significant improvement in your child, I'll have no choice but to medicate her. What he explained to me is that children or adults, when they're in the depths of depression, sometimes medication can help to lift them slightly so that they can engage in psychological therapy. She didn't engage with the psychologist, and she was medicated. Fortunately, being in the business, I was able to get a referral to another psychologist, someone who I'd heard a lot of good things about, and my daughter and I started seeing her together. After about 6 months, the pediatrician was happy for her to stop her medication, but she hadn't resumed all the things she'd once enjoyed doing. At the beginning of year 6, the school sent out a note. They wanted to let parents know that they were introducing Interrelate, which is sex education. My daughter was adamant that she didn't want to do it, which I thought was a little strange because we'd always had very open conversations around these subjects in our home. And then one night, she called me into her room, and she was very, very distressed. And she said, "Mummy, I have done something terrible." I asked her if she could tell me anything more, and she shook her head, but she wrote 2 words on a piece of paper, and those words were sex and game. Now, in that moment, I felt panicked, I felt distressed, but I remained composed. I did what I knew my daughter needed. I sat down and comforted her, and I asked her if she could tell me anything more. What she said is, "Mummy, I did the one thing that you told me not to do. I was on a game and I started talking to someone I didn't know." And this was another 9-year-old little girl, but she told me that if I told anybody what we'd been doing on the game, I would go to jail. And what we'd been doing was we'd been mimicking, she didn't use the word mimicking, but we were doing sex things on the game. And she said, "So for 2 years, I've been terrified that the police are going to take me away from you. And I knew I couldn't tell you because otherwise I'd get this other little girl into big trouble." Again, I comforted her, and she looked at me and said, "Why are you not angry with me?" And I said to her, "Because you're a little girl. You're just a curious little girl." And I think it was an adult on the other side of the screen. And she said, no, it wasn't an adult. It was definitely another 9-year-old. And "Mummy, I went back more than once." And I said to her, sometimes when we do the wrong thing, we feel excited. We don't feel those early warning signs. But the most important thing is you've told me. She got some rest that night. I didn't. I had no idea where this could have happened. In our home, we had one iMac. It was in the kitchen, which was the place where most frequently everybody was always hanging out. And we had parental controls on the iMac. We had, age restriction. We had, time allocation. No one was allowed to go on multiplayer games. Nobody could download anything without permission. And my daughter didn't like sleepovers. So I really didn't know where this had happened. I called the police the next day, and I really called them because I wanted to know if they printed somewhere on their website a list of games that they knew predators hang out on. And they said, "No, we don't, because wherever a child is online, they are predators, and they are on all the games." They asked me if my daughter was willing to come in to make a statement, and I said, well, no, she's too distressed, but also she hadn't been on the game for over 2 years. And then they said, "Could you give a message to your child?" They said this was definitely a predator. This is predatory behavior. What they do is they desensitize the child either with sexual language or sexual acts, and they threaten. They always threaten. Please tell your child she's innocent and safe. Later that day, and I still remember exactly where I was driving when I told my daughter I'd called the police, and she started crying. And she said, "Are they coming to get me?" And I said, "No." And I told her what they'd said. And I think that those words really did provide some comfort for her. At the beginning of year 7, I asked her if she'd reconsider signing up for a dance class. I knew she'd loved dancing. I knew it was one of her passions, and she reluctantly agreed. But it did. It reignited a passion, which remains to this day. And so I really do feel that there were a number of things that contributed to this beginning of a journey of recovery. One was obviously the way I responded to her on that night. Secondly was the police message to her. And lastly, me twisting her arm to get back involved in something that she really loved. I've also been through incidents with my older son. So a few years after my daughter's disclosure, my son came out at 15. And this resulted in him being significantly bullied, both online and in the physical world. A year later, he was involved in a sexting incident. And this is one moment which I'm not proud of, because I reacted the way I advise parents not to react. I got upset. But once I'd calmed down, I went and I apologized to him. And you may say, why apologize? He'd done the wrong thing. I knew he'd made an impulsive decision and he really needed my help. So together, we agreed that Snapchat would die. We killed the account. He lost the app for a year, but we worked through those consequences together. When he was 18, on the eve of his HSC trial examinations, he lost a friend by suicide. Now, as a parent, when you are navigating these issues with your children, you feel absolutely alone. I had no idea who to talk to apart from my husband. I felt ashamed, I felt responsible. I'd been unable to protect my children, and this is despite the fact that as adolescents I had things in place. For example, there was screen time and parental controls on their phone and laptop. They had to hand their devices into me every night. Apps were shut down during school hours, and there were conversations about why. We spoke a lot about online safety. But it still didn't get me off the hook. And the one thing I've learned is that if you give your child social media, parental controls does nothing. The only thing parental controls will do is prevent the child from downloading the app, but once you say yes to that app, you're letting them enter a world which we actually know very little about, because what we do on social media is so different to what our children do. So what I decided to do to cope was to get educated. I started following cyber safety educators, experts. I enrolled in online courses, I completed certified training, and I'm still in the process of completing a degree in criminology and criminal justice. I really wanted to understand the risks for our children. When my little boy in 2019 started primary school, with some of this knowledge behind me, I was concerned with how much exposure and how much freedom some of his peers were allowed online. And instead of being that parent and giving other parents lectures, I decided to start a Facebook group. And I invited friends and family, and I allowed them to invite people into the group. And really my intention was to have a place where parents could be supported, where they could ask questions, and where they could find out about risks and what to do, and etc. As well as this, I decided to offer cyber safety consultations, because although on the group you can post anonymously, I was well aware that there were some parents who certainly wouldn't want to even do that. You feel very vulnerable. I knew that, I'd been there. I wouldn't have posted anonymously even on a Facebook group. That group has now grown to over 5,000 members. And most of those are parents of children who are very, very young, all the way up to adolescent, who really just want to know what to do. They just want to know about the risks and how to keep their children safe. Now, a couple of months after I started the group, a friend of mine, Caroline Allen, knew that I was still struggling with what had happened to my daughter. I was feeling ashamed. It still weighed heavily on me, and she suggested I write the story down, just for me. And I did so in one sitting. Now, at that time, I'd been able to talk about a lot of online safety issues with my daughter, but not the incident. She could not talk about what had happened to her. So I told her I'd written the story, and she said, I don't want to read it. And I said, that's okay. It's here if and when you change your mind. And she did a week later. She came and asked to read it, and a few days after that, she asked if she could share it with a friend. And what it did is, writing that story opened up a journey of healing for both of us. She was able to tell me that the incidents had taken place at a friend's house. She was able to ask me why her memory was so scatty, and we were able to talk about trauma. A year later, November 2020, someone who I admired deeply, Colin Karchner, suddenly passed away. Now, Colin was a speaker in America who used to talk very openly, honestly, in a very undiluted way about the risks our children face online. He would talk about mental health issues that children are facing, predators, cyberbullying, etc. Not long before his passing, I'd listened to a podcast in which he'd interviewed Chris McKenna from Protect Young Eyes. And Chris said something that resonated with me. He said something along the lines of how much he appreciated it when trauma could be turned into something positive. And this was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. I thought, is it time to step out from behind the shadow and put my name to the story? But of course, I couldn't do this without my daughter's permission. So I went to my daughter and I said to her, how would you feel if I put my name to the story? And her response honestly surprised me. She said, Mummy, I need you to be my voice. She said, I need you to help other parents not let this happen to their child. She said, I want you to put it in a book and let's choose a charity that we can donate some of the proceeds to. And that book is here this evening. And we've also chosen the Child Rescue Coalition. They're an organization in America who actually provides software for police to track predators, and they published her story a year ago in their newsletter. But really, I'm here tonight sharing the story with you because of her bravery. It was her bravery in saying yes to me that has allowed me to share the story openly with other people. I'm going to now tell you a little bit about how I've educated my 8-year-old, because I had all these years of education and I'd learned a whole lot of things that I didn't know when my older children were little, regrettably. And where I like to start is with body safety education, because I believe this is really fundamental in keeping children safe, both in the online world and the physical world. So I've started by teaching him the correct names for all of his body parts. This eliminates feelings of shame for the child. So we refer to our private body parts. Those are the parts that we cover when we go to the beach. We also need to tell our children that our mouth is a private body part and that nobody gets to see or touch their private body parts, and they don't get to see or touch anyone else's. The other reason it's important is because it's a deterrent for predators. So if a child is engaged in an online chat and uses the correct names for their body parts, the predator will be aware that there's conversation going on in the home and that there's a chance that child may make a disclosure, and the chances are he'll move on to another child. The other thing we've done is we've talked about our early warning signs, and this is where in your body do you feel it when you're nervous, scared, worried. I've told my son, every time you feel that, you can come and tell me or another safe adult. And I've reminded him it is not a child's responsibility to keep themselves safe. It's an adult's responsibility to keep a child safe. Now, even if you have done this with your children, you will know that children don't come up and say, I have my early warning signs. They'll go, I have a headache, I feel sick, I have a tummy ache. And it's really up to you as the adult to assess the situation and to see what's going on for them. And I'll give you an example. So at the end of the first lockdown, it was my son's first day back at school. And we were in the car, and he said to me, I've got something stuck in my throat. Now, I knew he didn't, so I said, can you tell me anything else? And he started crying, and he said, I don't want any air. So what this showed me was quite how anxious he was feeling after I don't know how many weeks in lockdown in the safety of his home going back to school. And I said to him, thank you for telling me those are your early warning signs. So instead of dropping you outside school, which is what the school had requested, I'm going to take you in to the office and I'm going to leave you with a safe adult. And fortunately, that happened to be the principal. She called me an hour later and she said he's calm and back in class. But it gives you an example of how they'll throw out some symptom, and it really is up to you to explore that with them. The next thing, choosing a safety team. Now, I do this at the beginning of every school year with my son. We choose 5 adults. They're not all from the same family. And I remind him that he has to feel comfortable approaching those adults if he needs to tell them anything. When I have the names, I let them all know by email who they are, And I remind them that if he were to come to them with anything, that he should be thanked, he should be reassured that he's believed, and that he will be told he will be helped, because children very rarely make disclosures unless there's some validity behind them. So that's really crucial. We've also talked about the difference between safe and unsafe secrets. Now, many parents tell me, well, we don't use the word secret, and that's fine because we don't really either in our family, but it's very important still to talk about the difference. Essentially, an unsafe secret has no end. So if we think about the case with my daughter, if you tell anyone what we've been doing on the game, you will go to jail or be arrested. There's no end. Unsafe. We also need to remind children that it's not always accompanied by early warning signs, because sometimes they assume that if something's really dangerous, they're going to feel something. And no, that's not always the case. Like with my daughter, she went back a few times. But really the key is that it's got no end, whereas a safe secret is like a present from mum or dad. Now, I really would encourage you to explain that to your children over and over and over, because at some point they'll be asked to keep a secret, and it may not be you have to keep the secret. It may just be you mustn't ever tell anybody. You just have to let them know that if they're asked to keep something from anybody else that has no end, they need to talk to an adult, a safe adult. The other thing I've done is I've talked to him about stranger danger. And I've reframed those, I've changed that whole language to be tricky behavior, tricky people. Now, the reason I've done this is because we know over 90% of cases of abuse in the physical world is done by someone the child knows. So if we use the word stranger and someone from their family comes to them and asks them to do something that they may not be comfortable doing, they may think, well, it's not a stranger, it's probably okay. So that's where I've changed that language with my son. I've also had to remind him that tricky people can be children, adolescents, or adults. Unfortunately, we are seeing a spike in child-on-child sexual abuse. So it is really important that we need to teach our children this. Now, the next thing I get parents looking a little horrified, but I'll go with it. Sex education. So I started at 5. I read a book to him called Where Did I Come From? It's an old book from the 70s with funny little pictures. It's all about conception and birth. And to be honest, he was actually more interested in his own birth. But I revisit that book frequently because I know that I guess what I'm saying is I really want him to know that I'm comfortable talking about these issues, that there's nothing that's off, that he can't talk to me about. As well as this, I've read to him a series of books by an author called Holly Ann Martin. And she talks a lot about body safety, but she also goes on to talk about private pictures and videos posted online. And I've told him that there's a word for that, and it's called porn. And we never use the word pornography with children because they don't hear that in the playground. They'll hear porn. And I've told him if anyone ever tries to show him something or talk about it, he can come and tell me. Once again, demonstrating that I'm comfortable talking about these issues. I want everybody to be aware of the fact that it really is a matter of when, not if, their child will be exposed. The sad reality is that the average age is between 8 and 11. Some cases younger, and in some cases older, but that is the average age. So we really need to be getting in there early so that they know that they can talk to us, because it can be very confronting for children. The last thing I've done is I have introduced a code word. Now, you may wonder why, because of all this conversation, but I know that children don't like to disappoint their parents. What I've told him is, you will make mistakes. We've talked about his brain and how the last part of his brain to develop will only develop when he's in his early 20s. And that part is responsible for, amongst many other things, impulse control. So I've told him that, and I've said to him, but if you're ever worried that I'm going to be upset or angry or disappointed, you can use the code word which we chose together, and I will sit down and listen to you, and I will help you. We have to remember that, children read our facial expressions and our tone of voice and our body language, and so we have to, practice what we preach. We really have to mean it when we tell them that they can come to us with anything. So what I'm now going to do is just give you a few extra tips about prevention of online child exploitation. The first is probably the second most important, and that is children should never be allowed to use an internet-connected device in their bedroom or bathroom. Now, many teenagers like to take their phones into their bathroom, but this should never, ever be allowed. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, police found conversation on the dark web in which the predators were talking with each other and saying that this is exactly where they want the children. Not only that, we're seeing a spike in self-generated content. This is children producing child sexual exploitation material on their own in their bedroom. And we really are seeing a dramatic escalation of that. It's become almost one of the leading problems. Finally, conversation. Now, our children, actually it's the wrong word to use because children hate conversations with parents. So I'd actually say chats. Be guided by your child. The moment they look like they're losing interest, stop. When I chat to my son, which is probably about 3 times a week, it's a chat no more than 5 minutes. But make them so frequent so that they know that you're happy to talk about this stuff with them. In 2020, February 2020, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation brought out a report in which they'd interviewed many parents and children. Over 75% of parents said that they would respond with anger if their child sent a picture of themselves or spoke to a stranger online. The children said they knew that their parents would respond this way, and therefore they would definitely not tell them, they would tell a peer or a sibling, and this is not what we want. We really want them to know that we are there to help them. The internet is not age segregated. Last year, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children reported over 29 million reports, and the majority of those contained child sexual exploitation. So, in all honesty, if we are not vigilant and we do not supervise our children, they are at risk. Thank you, everyone, for listening.